So, good evening. Thank you all so much for coming tonight to what will no doubt be an illuminating and exciting lecture. My name is Nikki Coutura. I am a co-director of Relationships and Amplification at Resist, and one of the lead organizers of the Justice is Essential lecture series. Before I begin, big shout out and thank you to my coworkers, Yanni Burgos, Kathy LeBron, oh yeah, and Jasmine Gomez, who've helped a lot with the logistics. Another thank you to First Church for letting us use this gorgeous space. And another big thank you to Frugal Bookstore, an independent Black-owned bookshop in Roxbury that helped us procure some copies of Robin's book for purchase and signing. Resist started in 1967 with the call to resist illegitimate authority during the Vietnam War. The call was issued to support draft resistance in opposition to the colonial war unfolding in Vietnam. The call was signed by over 20,000 people and mobilized activists and academics across the country and became a central document in the 1968 conspiracy trial of Reverend William Sloane Coffin, Dr. Benjamin Spock, Michael Ferber, Marcus Raskin, and Mitchell Goodman, who became known as the Boston Five and soon after five of Resist's founders. In the fall of 1967, these five men helped organize a ceremony at the Arlington Street Church here in Boston, where draft-age men would turn in their draft cards and pledge to refuse induction and go to prison. While the case was thrown out on procedural grounds, the Boston Five would become well-known organizers in the anti-war movement. Joining with Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Robert Lowell, and Barbara Guest, Resist would be founded and soon after would start financially supporting revolutionary movements in the fight for freedom. They'd go on to support the Black Panther Party, ACT UP, the Young Lords, Critical Resistance, Black Workers for Justice, the American Indian Movement, and many, many others. Today, Resist is a grassroots foundation, meaning that we do not have an endowment that we skim the interest off of, and instead we raise our budget every single year, budgeting over 50% of it to support grassroots movements. There are three I'd like to highlight. For the Girls is a collective of Black trans people in New York that provide no strings attached rental assistance and money for gender-affirming healthcare to other Black trans people in New York City. Mobilization for Mumia is a Philly-based grassroots org that has played an instrumental role in educating and agitating for the release of Elder Mumia Abu Jamal and successfully aided and abetted the release of the Move 9. The Human Rights Coalition, not to be confused with the Human Rights Campaign, is a Pennsylvania-based abolitionist org that after 20 years this summer freed their executive director and co-founder, Shakabuna Marshall, who spent 17 years in solitary. I could keep going, but time is short. Needless to say, Resist continues to take stock of what our movements need, is accountable to them, and aims to release funds as urgently as possible. I've had the distinct, now to our speakers. I could read their bios, but that seems a little impersonal to me, and I could highlight their accolades, of which there are many, but instead I want to talk about the first time I met them. I've had the distinct honor and privilege of inviting both Robin and Nyle to my alma mater on behalf of Students for Justice in Palestine. They are still the two lecturers that had the most lasting impact on my politics. Robin came in 2016, where his lecture drew between the historical continuities between South African apartheid, Jim Crow South, and the occupation of Palestine. He came at a pretty politically intense time on campus when Joy Correga, a professor of rhetoric and composition, was both a faculty sponsor of this event as well as instrumental in helping the Black Student Union write and disseminate their list of demands. As a means to discredit both SJP and the Black Student Union, Zionist alumni went through Correga's private Facebook page and exposed her for, quote, anti-Semitic Facebook posts. Alumni flew into the event, bringing with them Breitbart, Fox News, CNN, and many other news outlets. A venue that could hold 350 people squeezed 500. So wrapped in silence and awe by Robin's presentation, he would get a standing ovation from every single student and a big eye roll from every single alum. While I could recount the salient arguments Robin made, that's a different conversation entirely. Instead, what struck me the most and stuck with me up until today was his fearlessness and conviction. Faced with a lot of pressure, Robin stuck to his values and his principles and refused to dilute his politics to reactionary pressure. He taught me that standing up for the oppressed isn't easy but necessary. At the end of the day, dreaming of freedom requires us to be steadfast and consistent in who and what we stand for. This book, Freedom Dreams, is a testament and a love letter, as he writes in the introduction, to the movements who stood up for what was right and denounced and rallied against the systems that stand on the way to freedom. A few years later, Nyle would come to my alma mater in a lecture aptly titled "Freedom Dreaming, Black Palestinian Solidarity in an Age of Repression." Similarly, I could tell you about the way that Nyle deftly analyzed the congruencies between Black and Palestinian struggle and the recognition that one freedom cannot come without the other. But what struck me most about Nyle was how he spoke to us. He stepped away from the podium, was gracious and receptive to questions and comments from students trying to understand. He didn't speak at us, he spoke to us. And with it, he highlighted that there was a revolutionary potential in every single relationship that he was making that night. When we would say goodbye, he'd end the night by saying, "Let's build together." I say all this because 5, 10, 15 years from now, when you're living in your walkable, renewable, post-revolution commune, and thinking back to tonight, whether you remember what was said, I hope you remember how it was said. As Robin beautifully points out in his book, relationships are the cornerstone to so many movements and moments of revolutionary change. Combined with the conviction that Robin, Nyle, and many other revolutionaries display, it is ultimately what will make our freedom dreams a reality. Without further ado, please welcome Nyle Fort and Robin Kelley.
How y'all doing? Come on, you can do better than that. How y'all doing? Y'all really must like freedom and dreaming if you come out on a Friday night at 7:30. Supposed to laugh. Okay, great. I'm not going to talk too long, but I do want to just say a few words. And before I do that, I do want to thank Nikki for that just beautiful introduction. And also just going back to years ago, Nikki, I can talk about Nikki for a long time, you know, about the generosity of your spirit, the expansiveness of your analysis, but the way that you've made me feel. That hug that I gave you, you know, in the middle of the conversation really speaks to how I feel about you. I want to thank Resist. I want to thank the church, First Church in Boston. I want to thank everyone who helped put this together, the folks who got the food out there. I didn't get a chance to get any, so make sure you leave me some after this, because I will be hungry. Okay, let's go. How y'all feeling? Real good, okay. When Nikki invited me to do an event with Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley for the 20th anniversary of Freedom Dreams, the Black radical imagination, I started having nightmares. Not the kind that terrifies me at night. I had them while wide awake, thinking to myself, what could I possibly say about the book that completely changed my life? I began to panic. Then I did what I always do when I'm ridden with anxiety. I watched Netflix and tried to forget about it. I first heard about Freedom Dreams while protesting in Ferguson, Missouri. It was October 2014, just 2 months after white police officer Darren Wilson shot and killed Black teenager Michael Brown Jr. People from across the country came to the St. Louis area to join the local uprising that would become a national movement against police violence and systemic racism. I rode to Ferguson with 41 other people on a Freedom Ride bus from New York City. All I can remember about that ride was the heat of my rage. I was scorching with anger. I was a young, zealous, and naive activist who desperately wanted to be a revolutionary. But I know now what I didn't know then. I really had no clue what a revolution was, let alone what it would take to win. My understanding of revolutionary struggle was centered around what was wrong about the world. I knew that Black kids should be able to play at the park and jog through neighborhoods and sleep on grandma's couch and wear a hoodie and listen to trap music and sell Lucy's without being killed. I knew that human beings didn't belong in cages and that the most dangerous criminal in America is the American government itself. I knew that racism cuts deeper than the N-word and police killings and whatever they talk about on Fox News. But I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know what I wanted. Y'all still with me?
Yes, sir.
I didn't have a vision of the kind of world I believed was worth fighting for. Not until I met Dr. Kelley in the midst of the Ferguson uprising. I was at a strategy session with local organizers and activists from around the country. We were debating what we were going to do beyond the actions and the demonstrations. A few hours into the session, Dr. Kelley came and he spoke to us about revolution and imagination. I was completely blown away. He talked about radical social movements as more than political struggles, but as processes that ethical formation that change how we live, how we love, how we think, how we worship, how we eat, and how we dream. He made it clear that genuine revolution would take more than facing tear gas and staring down cops and seizing political power. Revolutionary struggle would require nothing less than the total transformation of our entire way of life. So when I got back home, I read Freedom Dreams like my life depended on it. And I could spend the rest of the evening quoting passages that are as relevant today as they were then. But for the sake of time, I want to read two sentences that I think lie at the heart of the book and the heart of our struggle today. Without new visions, Dr. Kelley writes, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not simply a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. So just for a minute, I want to meditate on the idea revolutionary transformation. Revolution. Can y'all say that? Revolutionary transformation. All right, I come out the black church. We believe in this thing called call and response. I know this ain't a black church, but it's a church and I'm a black preacher, so. All right, revolutionary transformation. Or what I've been thinking of as the spiritual force of the black radical tradition. The spiritual force of the black radical tradition. In Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, a stunning scene unfolds when a community of freedmen and former slaves assembles in the woods. After a moment of prayer, baby Suggs slams her stick on the ground and beckons everyone to let loose. A frenzy ensues. Men dance, children laugh, women wail. And before long, if you read closely, you can witness their twisting hips and catch their roaring laughter and smell their salty tears melt into an ecstatic choreography of praise and protest. Then after the dust settles, baby Suggs, the 70-year-old unchurched preacher, addresses the multitude who every Saturday afternoon carries their scarred backs and calloused hands into the clearing. Toni Morrison describes baby Suggs' message this way. She did not tell them to clean up their lives or to go and sin no more. She did not tell them that they were the blessed of the earth, its inheriting meek, or its glory bound pure. She told them that the grace they could have was only the grace that they could imagine. That if they could not see it, they would not have it. For baby Suggs, attaining this kind of grace required these New World Africans to choose love in a society that did not love them. Here, Suggs preached, in this here place we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Baby Suggs' sermon is short and the message is clear. Only love can save us. Freedom Dreams, as I've read it over the last 8 years, is a kind of sermonic history of black radicalism. By that I mean Dr. Kelley writes about these movements of liberation from communism, surrealism, radical black feminism to the quest to the return to Africa and the demand for reparations as clarion calls for moral transformation. That is, as processes that can transform our hearts, minds, and spirits as much as our material conditions, our public policies, and our social arrangements. In these freedom dreams, going back to Africa was not simply about land, it was about liberation, total liberation, liberation from the physical chains of slavery and liberation from the psychological chains of black inferiority. The Maroons, the Garveyites, the Afrofuturists, with all of their flaws and contradictions, imagine and struggle to build another world on the continent, in the mountains and swamplands, aboard the mothership. Total liberation, liberation of the heart and the mind and the soul from the oppressive ideology of white supremacy, from the relentless obsession with private property and the spiritual abyss of American empire. In other words, quests to return to Africa were guided as much by a spiritual force than it was a geographical destination. In these freedom dreams, the demand for reparations is more than a paycheck to repair the harms of the past, but a call to invest into a collectively liberated future. Although, let me be clear, I'll take the stimulus package. I'll pay my tithes and I'll buy my Jordans. All right, maybe I'll just. Dr. Kelley is clear. Formations such as the Revolutionary Black Workers and the Republic of New Africa and the Black Radical Congress were not knocking on the door of the capitalist economy. They were knocking down the door of an economic system that created the need for reparations in the first place. These black radicals demanded funds to invest in land banks and publishing houses and television networks and the development of cooperatives and support for anti-colonial struggles in Africa and the establishment of black colleges. In their hands, reparations was about organizing economies of love, bonds of care, and a marketplace of affection where human value is determined by the breath in our body, not money in our bank account. In these freedom dreams, the liberation of black women is inextricably tied to the liberation of all people. Black radical women expose the nightmares of both racial oppression within white society and sexist oppression among black men, all while challenging systems of imperialism and capitalism and colonialism and queer antagonism. Barbara Smith, Lorraine Hansberry, Anna Julia Cooper, Shirley Chisholm, Frances Beale, Toni Cad Bambara, Fannie Lou Hamer, Angela Davis, the National Black Feminist Organization, the Third World Women's Alliance, the National Domestic Workers Union, and the Combahee River Collective, just to name a few, called on all of humanity to break free from the chains of mental slavery and to embrace an ethics of revolutionary love. In these freedom dreams, restructuring the political economy is not about getting more money. It's about having more time with family, more time with nature, more time to make love, more time to worship, more time to explore the many wonders of the world, more time to dance and to sing and to play, more time to think and to learn, more time to grieve and to celebrate, more time to make friends and to count the stars. The communist imperative, the socialist impulse, the Marxist evolution and vision with all of its imperfections and shortcomings is not just a simple set of economic arrangements. It is about more time to cherish life, to love ourselves, and to learn to love each other. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say what the best of the Black radical tradition has said for centuries. Freedom struggle does not only save lives, it saves souls. It is no coincidence that W.E.B. Du Bois' account of African-American life is called The Souls of Black Folk, not the social conditions of Black folk, not the material realities of black folk. Of course, Du Bois focused much of his intellectual energies tracing the chilling effects of the color line, but like Cedric Robinson's concept of racial capitalism, Du Bois emphasized the veil only to peel back the beauty it sought to disguise, but could never destroy. That's why every chapter opens in song, and why 4 of the 11 essays are artistic in form: the Elegy of His Son, the Lynching Parable, the Eulogy of Alexander Crummell, and his groundbreaking study of Negro spirituals, what he called sorrow songs. By unleashing the full range of his imaginative capacities, by plumbing the depth of his own soul, Du Bois did more than capture the brutality of racial oppression. He proclaimed the possibility of social transformation and the sheer beauty of black lives, of black life, and of life itself. And herein lies the spiritual force of the black radical tradition. It is a spirituality rooted in freedom and love. And by love, I don't just mean some abstract feeling or some abstract concept. By love, I mean the force that eliminates the distance that oppression creates between us. The force that eliminates the distance that oppression creates between us. The late Bell Hooks evangelized this spirit and gave it voice with her pen. In her essay, Love as the Practice of Freedom, she critiqued the absence of a powerful discourse in movements for social change. Without love, she wrote, our efforts to liberate ourselves and our world community from oppression and exploitation are doomed. Of course, Bell Hooks believed in love, study, and struggle. She coined the term white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy as a way to name the interlocking systems of oppression that constitute the foundations of the United States. But she also worried that an overemphasis on material conditions would overlook what she called the needs of the spirit. Our profound desire to be loved, held, affirmed, forgiven, and embraced by a beloved community. The great Grace Lee Boggs, who spent 7 decades of her life in and out of Detroit organizing, was guided by this spirit when she insisted that in order to change the world, we have to change ourselves. The Martinican psychiatrist France Fanon, who threw himself into the Algerian Revolution against French colonialism, was guided by this spirit when he wrote in The Wretched of the Earth that decolonization is not just the construction of a new society, but the construction of a new humanity. And of course, Toni Morrison's baby Suggs, who called on an enslaved and aggrieved community to dance and to cry and to shout, was guided by this spirit when she ended her sermon with the words, "Love your heart, for this is the prize." I just want to be clear, and I'm going to stop in 1 second. This spirit of black radicalism is not a substitute for protesting, organizing, and building campaigns. It is not a substitute, but the source of our movement's strength and the strength of our struggle to remake the world. Dr. Kelley sang of this spirit 20 years ago when he published the book that would raise a new generation of freedom fighters, a book that to this day continues to nourish my soul as much as my mind. I'm so very grateful for his voice, for his love, and for his assistance over the last 2 decades, that these freedom dreams may be deferred, but they have not died. Thank you.
Okay, so where are the deacons with the collection plate? You know, it's got to be passed around. And by the way, get out your hymn books, and we'll start with Amazing Grace. Amen. Oh man, my heart was like, I was supposed to be taking notes to respond, but like my heart was beating. And, you know, and I'll say some things about Nyle in a second, but I so appreciate you bringing up beloved and Toni Morrison. Some of you may know that I'm married to Setha, by the way, for real. Just look it up on Wikipedia. And so I got a big picture of Setha running through the swamps over our bed. And so I'm reminded about beloved every single day. And also, as you know, the story of beloved, of Margaret Garner, takes place in Ohio. And, you know, Oberlin is where, you know, we connected with Nikki. And it is, you know, Ohio is a very special state, has a very special history. And so I always make those connections in many ways. So thank you, Nikki, for this amazing invitation and for all the work that you're doing. And by the way, when I gave that talk in 2016, Nikki was a freshman, and with a bunch of really amazing students who were quite brave in terms of standing up to the administration, to the alumni, and to some faculty. And I have to say, students are always brave. My colleagues who are faculty are usually not, you know, and that's just how it goes. And to have a colleague, you know, like Nyle Fort, who is super brave in ways that I'll talk about in a second. But before I get into this conversation, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be joined in the audience by two people I want to hold up. There's many people, I won't name all, but specifically by Professors Keisha Green and Jamila Liscott, who are the founders of the Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engaged Research at UMass. It's an amazing organization. I had late lunch with them today, talking about the work that they're doing, a very brave organization that we need right now. And in fact, I think the Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engaged Research is an example, and those two in particular are an example of what it means when I write in a new introduction to turn freedom dreams from noun to verb, you know, from freedom dreams as a noun to freedom dreaming as a practice. So I'm just going to encourage you to look them up. There's a big donate button on the website. Hit that button and put as much money in it as possible, you know. So I just wanted to say that before we kind of begin. And there's many other people, all these great famous people in the audience. So it's really fitting to be here today in Boston talking about freedom dreams with my friend, Reverend Nyle Fort. And let me explain why. It's related and it's not related. So my father died in February 2020, February 29th, 2020. And it was a very complicated thing for me because I was estranged from him for 20 years before that. In other words, around the time I was writing Freedom Dreams, I wasn't really in conversation with him, and that was my choice. And so grieving was very difficult given our relationship, which I've written about, and you can read about it someplace else. But I'm here sitting next to not just a great friend, an amazing activist, but really the world's leading authority on Black mourning in relationship to struggle. So, you know, poor Nyle has to be like my therapist, my grievance counselor, and other things. But let me just say something about Boston and then why it's important. So he grew up here. My grandfather, Reverend Rafe Kelley, is the founding pastor of St. John's Missionary Baptist Church at 230 Warren, right, in Roxbury. Their house, which was only like 2 blocks from where I gave a reading of this book at the Grove Hall Library, Public Library on number 4 Schuyler. It was like just right there in the heart of where Grove Hall and Roxbury meet. I spent all my summers there. My grandfather used to keep his Cadillac in that raggedy garage and only drive it on Sunday. Only. And that was the day. You know, we'd get dressed up. And all the other days, we'd have to go hunting or fishing or go to the church, which then wasn't on Warren. It was actually at 135 Vernon, which is Lower Roxbury, and there's a church there today. So I have a lot of memories, and memories of trauma, memories of violence, because, my grandparents, which turned out not to be my actual grandparents, but that's another story, they believed, they believed in using the rod, that the rod is what you do when you want to love somebody, violence. And that is part of this sort of journey of what Freedom Dreams means, is also to kind of struggle with and escape the forms of violence that we have actually inherited. My father was super loved because he got his ass kicked all the time. And so then he super loved us and beat us. And I'm saying that as an ironic statement, not as a fact, but we were all beaten. And so I'm coming back to this city, walking those streets, seeing all the places I went, right across the street from Mosque number 11, which was there when I was a kid and is still there, right in the heart of Roxbury. And this is the life that I'm kind of confronting with as I sit here and talk about this book, a book that my father probably may have read and wouldn't have agreed with, in many ways. And so I'm always chasing this struggle to try to satisfy or make my father proud, right? Which is something I realized in my old age at 60, I didn't really have to do that. And it's only now that I'm learning how to grieve. And so the 20th anniversary edition kind of coincides with this kind of grieving process and recognizing what was lost in my relationship to a church and a congregation. And that's why I hope that part of what we're going to talk about is this question of spirituality, what Nyle kind of led with. Because that, in many ways, that search for what E.P. Thompson calls the energies of love, and this kind of spiritual dimensions of our movements, that's foundational to Freedom Dreams. The book was all about that. In fact, surrealism was my way of moving past the kind of Marxism that I was schooled in and all of its limitations. So I hope that we talk about that. And let me just explain, one other thing before I say, why I did this 20th anniversary edition. The other night, I was at the Schomburg having a great conversation with Femi Olufemi, who is a wonderful philosopher. He was a former student of ours student at UCLA, and about Freedom Dreams. And he had asked me a question about utopia. And it was a very good philosophy question. And that is, how do I reconcile my identification as utopian, like my mother, I talk about my mother as kind of, having utopian ideas, with the reality, right? That, utopia is perceived to be the perfect world. And the reality that we face every day is far from that. And I thought about it, I had a good answer, but I want to add to that answer right now because I realized that, people could read Freedom Dreams as utopian, but what does utopian really mean? Utopia means nowhere. It doesn't necessarily mean the perfect world. And part of being a student of Cedric Robinson, who had a definition of the Black radical tradition as meaning the revolutionary consciousness that proceeds from the whole history. That is to say, we are not defined by capitalism, we're not defined by settler colonialism. That's the context in which we enter. But our definition, our self-definition, comes from all kinds of generations and millennia of history and experience, right? And part of that has to do with the fact that we travel with our ancestors. They're with us. That we struggle, not for the here and now, we struggle for the future, and because we're obliged to struggle, right, by our ancestors. They told us we have to do this, and we have to do it for every generation before us, right? So what's more utopian than recognizing that the destination is nowhere because you're making that somewhere? So when Jane Cortez writes a book of poetry and she calls it Somewhere in Advance of Nowhere, that is the utopia that my mother saw. And when my mother, describes, when my mother says to us, if you walk around the streets on 157th and you see the fire hydrant wide open and water running down the side, if you look down, you'll see a rainbow. And that rainbow is formed by the alchemy of motor oil and water with the sun shining on it. She's not talking about the future. She's talking about the moment, like looking to find beauty where you are, and then using that as energies to fulfill the energies of love, right? And so one last thing about that, if utopia for us is not the perfect world, that makes perfect sense because we come out of traditions where there can never be a perfect world. Nobody wants a perfect world. If you are a musician and you're improvising, perfection is the worst thing that could happen to you. You want imperfection. You want a discovery. You want to make mistakes. And that's why we come out of a tradition, again, that proceeds from the whole history, in which our ancestors, are much closer to what we think of as deities. Why is that important? Because our ancestors are not perfect. In fact, the Orisha tradition, has all these characters, Shango, Yemeya, who are very much not only imperfect, but they're jealous. Sometimes they're mean. Sometimes they're nice. That's why you gotta give them stuff. You gotta give them sugar and some honey and some money to just so that they're not on your back. That's the beauty of our lives. So when we struggle for the transformation to come, it's not for the perfect world, it's for the world that is certainly an improvement out in the world we're in right now, but it's the one that we can imagine that provides for us the things that we need at the moment, knowing that in that perfect world there'll be more things to struggle for. So it is ongoing. And that's in some ways what I want to really emphasize. One last thing. I was going to read from the book, but actually I'd much rather have a conversation with Nyle. So why did I do this 20th anniversary? Well, the book wasn't out of print, by the way. It was still in print, but I really felt compelled to take stock of where we are now, especially in the wake of the 2020 protests. But not just that. I mean, in the wake of the Occupy movement, which we have to remember was very, very important. In the wake of anti-police protests, which did not begin with George Floyd, it actually began, in the 19th century with the invention of the police, of the modern police force. But in some ways, what culminated in those protests in spring 2020 was exactly where Nyle was in 2014 in Ferguson, or where the Dream Defenders were in Florida, right? That is an important sort of context for rethinking what happened in the last 20 years. And also in the face of resurgent fascism, which was clearly a response to these radical insurgencies. Remember, January 6th, wasn't simply a group of crazy people who just came out of nowhere. They were the warrior class and the white middle class who were in some ways responding to these insurgencies. Fascism is always a response to the struggles of the oppressed. Fascism doesn't come from nowhere. It is a response, it's a way to put the lid on those struggles. And again, I don't want to say much, but I really look forward to conversing with all of you here. One of the things that the new edition includes is this beautiful foreword by poet, activist Aja Monet. And I just say you should buy the book for the foreword. In fact, you don't have to read the rest of it. You could cut it out, put it on your wall. And that foreword was important to me for a lot of reasons, not just because Aja is one of my favorite poets and a really great friend, but because it connects the book with what is arguably the best generation of revolutionaries I think we've ever had, right? The best generation. And I include our great, folks who are involved in SNCC and CORE, all comedy, all that stuff. But this generation, this is a generation of Nyle Fort. This is the generation of Derek Purnell, of Phil Agnew, Charlene Carruthers, Damon Williams. There's many, many, many. This is a generation that produced the Dream Defenders and BYP 100 and We Charge Genocide and the Centers, Assata's Daughters, and here, the Massachusetts Bail Fund, Stable Ground Boston, Black Lives Matter, and of course the Center for Anti-Racist Research. All this stuff that's going on now, I think is far in advance of even where we were when we kind of romanticized those moments in the late 60s or even the early 60s. And it's far in advance because I believe that this vision of who we are is much more expansive, It's not as if everything's resolved, but there's space now to think of us as a community and Black people in all of its multivaried ways. We're not afraid of identity anymore. We're not afraid of gender difference as much as we were. We're not afraid of understanding we're not afraid of recognizing that even among our youth, that we don't necessarily have to have squeaky clean people, I was talking to Keisha and Jamila earlier about the way that Black youth have been the object of derision for the generation when I was writing Freedom Dreams. They were considered predators. And, we can get mad at Hillary Clinton and, for using the term predator, but our people they were using predator. Black people were saying Black youth are predators, unless they're good. And so we're not playing that anymore, There's no sort of, the idea of innocence is sort of off the table now. We have to take all of us, embrace all of us, and recognize that the abolitionist moment we're in is one that recognizes that we're no longer going to play the game of value judgment and say that some people should be locked up and others shouldn't, right? This is the future, and it's, I think, a beautiful possibility. So even in the midst of this fascist threat, I think there are great possibilities. In any case, so the book has this new introduction where I reflect on sort of where we've been. It has this epilogue where I replace the original epilogue. It includes this kind of speculative fiction. I'll let you read it. It's kind of a wild story that I wrote, actually, in 2000 for the purposes of putting it in the book, and I pulled it at the last minute, and I explained why. And then finally, in that epilogue, I talk about other movements in other places like Detroit, Michigan, Jackson, Mississippi, and elsewhere, where people on the ground are, again, engaged in practice of turning freedom dreams from noun to verb. And of course, nothing's done, but you could see a lot of this activity right now. And finally, one last plug. I will read one paragraph from my daughter, but to be clear, the examples I give in the book are just a few. I want to hold up one more and make a plug for the Communiversity South, which is a project of Black Workers for Justice, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary right now. And they're based in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. These are folks who are cross-generational, doing amazing political education, community-based education, and I want to encourage you to look them up, give them money, and support what they're doing, okay? So one last thing I'm just going to read to you, just a couple paragraphs. I said, so, it should be clear by now, and will become clearer as you read this book, that the Black radical imagination does not stand still. It lives and breathes and moves with the people. The best we can do is catch a glimpse of how people in motion have envisioned the future and what they did to try to realize or enact that future. But every freedom dream shares a common desire to find better ways of being together without hierarchy and exclusion, without violence and domination, but with love, compassion, care, and friendship. And once again, my daughter, Kelley, who lived with this book longer than anyone beside me, really grasped this core truth with astonishing clarity. When asked by an interviewer whether progressive movements can retool citizenship as a way to reproduce a culture of care, she replied, and I quote, "Better ships than citizenship include friendship, relationship, or even a pirate ship, where unauthorized motley formations are bound together to disrupt notions of the private, of property, of wealth and its concentration. The kind of citizenship I dream of is one where we acknowledge our attachment to each other, desire to be attached to one another in relations other than property relations, where serving the other is a way of serving the self." Okay? I'm sure that is in the Bible. It sounds very romantic. And I'm serious. But isn't that the origin of all the things we want to make and bring into the world? The power of the love letter is that it is written without the guarantee of a response. And to that, I say, what are radical social movements if not love letters? Thank you.
Is this on? Should be on. Yeah, I can talk about it now. It should be on. Oh no.
I'm like the tech person. But there we go.
Okay.
It's gonna come on.
Yes.
It's on now?
Is it on now? No. I can try yours.
Okay, well.
All right, cool.
Or you can just use this one. Hello.
Okay. Okay, so I've never done this thing before, where I've like done an interview type thing. So y'all have to bear with me. Don't look at me funny, because then I get real nervous. Like smile underneath your mask. I could see it in your eyes. Yes, I've never done this before, so y'all be patient with me. I have just a few questions that I want to ask you. And then we're going to open it up for question and answer to the entire group here and then also online to the people who are listening in. So the first question is really about this phrase, love, study, and struggle. I believe it was 2016 where there was a forum in the Boston Review talking about this idea of love, study, and struggle, and as it's related to this very particular political moment. And you wrote this amazing essay, and I just wanted to hear you talk about the relationship between love, study, and struggle. Of course, there's different ways that we could think about it. It could be additive, like love plus study plus struggle, or the words can qualify each other somehow. So yeah, I just want to hear you talk a little bit about the phrase and how the words work together.
Well, thank you. The context is really important because Panache, who's here, knows this. But that period from about like 2014 to 2016 was so formative around the globe. And, part of what I was responding to was like, fees must fall, roads must fall, Missouri, right? And sometimes we forget, like, black student movement especially was at the forefront. And that's all tied to Ferguson, all tied to like how you all converged there and why, and that's also tied to the war in Gaza. So it's all these things that are happening at the same time. And that piece, I was actually trying to write a kind of my own kind of critical love letter to student movements, but also holding up those movements that didn't see a boundary between what they were trying to change in the classroom and what support they were trying to give to all the physical plant workers and cafeteria workers and all the people who run the university. And those kinds of connections are one of the amazing things about the South African student struggle, was that in most cases they were lockstep with the workers against the state, against the ANC, you know? And so that's part of that, the context for it. And what I was simply doing was, you know, there's not much to it, but I keep, a long time ago, way before that, those are the three things I had to remind myself to do. So in my desk, I have like a sliding, it's an old raggedy desk, you know, because it's UCLA. And I have a sliding metal thing, which you could put stuff on, and I have taped on there, love, study, struggle. And it wasn't necessarily in that order. It was like, I got to do all these things simultaneously. And I can't forget any one of them in this. And again, it's like I'm talking to a preacher here, you know, and you've got the Trinity. That's like the Holy Trinity for me, you know, because the only way to study is in struggle. Study without struggle is not really good study. The only way to struggle is with love, you know. Otherwise, you end up being cynical and rudderless and all that other stuff. And you cannot, you know, it's like, it's not rock, paper, scissors, but it really is the Holy Trinity, you know. And that's how I see it. And it made sense as a title because I felt at the time that if we're going to have something called Black Studies, it's got to have that Trinity, you know. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I mean, it was such an impactful piece. I know for me, being in graduate school at the time, and there were we were 2 years into what came out of Ferguson, and we started seeing these different sort of movement habits. It went from the explosion on the streets to us trying to figure out, I mean, I mentioned it in the talk, like, okay, like, how do we actually do movement beyond the protest? And a part of the piece that you wrote was sort of loving criticism. And I know you pretty well, and I know that you're probably the most generous person I know, except my mama. My mama's the most generous. Until she's not, and then but like, you're very generous. But I do want to know, with all your generosity, what are some of the aspects of our movement that are rooms for improvement, are areas of growth? Even with all of this amazing energy that we see going on, what do you also see, looking back 20 years, but also 8 years to Ferguson, of some areas of growth in the movement?
Okay, I'm only going to try to answer that question if you answer it too. Okay, so I'm going to give it back to you. You know, it's hard to say. It's hard to say because, you know, when I wrote that, there were clear areas that I was kind of addressing. And in one area that I kind of got in trouble for, though I still stand by it, had to do with, and this was so much movement as much as a kind of general position coming out of student protests. It wasn't coming out of Ferguson, by the way. Ferguson, Ferguson, as you know better than me, was really amazingly intergenerational, more so than we think. And it wasn't so much students, but what I saw were students who were making demands on the administration to give them a curriculum, as opposed to taking one. You know, and I was trying to say, like, you know, study is not something that you, like, go to school, pay for it, and wait for someone to give you what you need to take it. We need to form study groups. We need to sort of resist the university. We could be of it, get resources, but ultimately, there's a way that we have to train ourselves and understand that universities are not necessarily our friends. It's not a place where you get love. You know, they don't love you back. It doesn't mean that you don't go to university. And of course, Derica was one of the interlocutors in that thing and wrote a really beautiful, brilliant piece. So that said, part of what I was trying to get at was like, how do you become, as young people, truly independent with knowledge and connect knowledge to struggle? And that's another, and that's not a new problem. That's an old problem. That's the problem that led me to Freedom Dreams in the first place. That is young people saying, you know what, the academy is so bankrupt, and it is, and so therefore I don't really want to read anything, I want to be in the streets. I said, but everyone I know in the streets trying to read stuff. You know, I mean, they're really trying to read stuff. They're trying to understand. So you don't have to separate those things. And then I guess a third thing that I saw then was the trauma language. And I just got up and talked about my own trauma. So it's not like, so don't misunderstand me when I say that sometimes we allow the language of trauma to individualize our struggles. It's not saying that there's no trauma. It's saying that sometimes the way the language is used, we have individual traumas, and that there's no solution, when in fact part of the response is our collective struggle. And I was having this sort of debate with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I really like, you know, I think it's really smart, but he made the statement about, he imagined an enslaved girl, not from any archive, he just kind of imagined it. And he's saying like, you know, because his argument was, you know, our history is nothing but violence. There's nothing there but violence. That is all there is. And he imagines this slave girl who he says doesn't know anything but her chains. I said, that's impossible. Because if we as black people, as African people, even under bondage, knew nothing but chains, then how do we create the most vibrant democracy in North America? Like, and then get crushed in the process. So part of what I was suggesting is that we have a history of resistance, of refusal, of drawing on both cultural and spiritual resources to refuse to be the thing that we're told we're supposed to be, you know? And if we can just kind of go back to that and build movements around that, our movements wouldn't be defined by thinking that all we should be focused on is anti-black racism. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be focused on that, but if we end there, then we don't really have much to go beyond that, okay? And that's what I was thinking then. But what I would love to hear from you is what you're thinking about now. What are your thoughts about the movements we're in, areas for improvement and that sort of thing, or, you know, your thoughts?
No, I'm not gonna do that. Oh, I have to, okay. Well, you know, when I first became an activist, everybody was doing everything wrong. No, for real. Like, I would go on Facebook, and I don't know if we had Twitter. We had Twitter, we very much had Twitter, and everything everybody was doing was wrong. I was zealous, and I knew what we needed to do to get free, and everything that everyone was doing except the people I was organizing with was doing it wrong. I was not generous like you, but it was really animated by a deep, sincere commitment to revolutionary struggle, however obscure or that I understood that concept. And so I say that to say, in 2014, if you were to ask me this question, I would just point fingers at different organizations and activists and say, well, of course, neoliberal culture has penetrated our social movement so much that it's hard to even tell the difference between the market and the movement. That in certain corners of today's activism, it's not that there's a sort of relationship between the market and the movement, but the movement itself has become so complicit. It's become almost a part of it. So there's that, but I think now, looking back, one, because I've just been humbled by how complex and how challenging it is to actually struggle in the long distance way that Mumia does, and so many people in our tradition, a long distance struggle, that I think part of what the challenge is not so much us as activists, but it's the conditions that create a dearth of spaces for us to have debate outside of Twitter, outside of Facebook, outside of Instagram. So you have this set of multinational big tech companies that love to see us argue all day online. And it becomes difficult, especially under a pandemic, where it's really difficult for us to come together in person, of how to have that kind of debate that you point out in the text. Because not everybody's like, it's not like a singular imagination that everybody gets on board with. There's a lot of contestation, argument. The chapters are arguing with themselves. Within the chapters themselves, there's debate. So I think that we have to push back this kind of neoliberal culture that makes it very difficult for us to have honest, principled disagreement. And that really is alluring to all of us. I mean, it's easy to just say the good guys and the bad guys, or the sort of ones who are, involved in that kind of market-driven culture. So I think we have to find publics, counter-publics, spaces to really struggle together. And I think you name in a lot of, in your forward, a lot of those exciting projects where people are doing that today. But I do want to talk about the Black radical imagination's relationship to multiracial movements. You talked about the language of anti-Black racism that became very popular within the last several years. We also saw in 2020 an explosion of protests of people all across different ages and races and geographies. So the Black radical imagination, how do we think about that alongside multiracial democracy, multiracial social movements?
You know, that's a good question. By the way, just on one last thing before I answer it is, Derek asked me a similar question in Washington, D.C. about social media and Twitter and how difficult it is to have principled debates. And one of the things I think I might have said this in the piece, but I think it's worth remembering is that, before, like, I'm an old person, so I was like, back in the early 80s, I was in all these like left organizations, and, we had internal papers, like internal position papers, and they were never meant for circulation. They were never meant to be posted someplace because you couldn't post it. And what was so great about it is that when you have a debate in the public domain and people could weigh in and you're standing behind a blog or not, you won't even reveal your actual identity, then you end up doing things like trying to get likes as opposed to like really struggling, because it's something about struggling within your organization where your ego has to be played down because it's only you all, and you could have principled disagreements and debates which are really productive. And that's very different from sort of saying, okay, you're trying to hate on me, and then next thing you know, I'm going to get the beehive to beat you down, I mean, it's like, it's very different. So I really appreciate that. Now, in terms of the Black radical imagination, it's a very tricky, very difficult question because in many ways, our history, and basically almost all the organizations and movements I talk about, except for maybe chapter 1, which is about search for the new land, which is about self-determination and Black land and Black, not property, but Black homeland. That comes out of the tradition of marronage, and marronage of trying to find a free space amidst a catastrophe to be able to live your life. But even marronage, if you know the history of it, was always open to all these other people. indigenous peoples. Sometimes marriage was joining with indigenous communities. Sometimes marriage included renegade white people who realized that their lives would be much better living in swamps with African peoples. And they were like, you know, as long as you're with us, as long as you're really willing to cooperate and you're against the system that has reduced us to property and we refuse that, then you're cool. And we don't tell the story of that. So multiracial, the most vibrant multiracial movements in North America have almost always been led by black people. It's not the other way around. Like we think, you know, we got these progressive white people trying to organize multiracial movements. That's what the like, you know, the Jacobin left thinks. You know, you got the progressive people and they're trying to build. No, we've been at the forefront of building multiracial movements. We're the ones during Reconstruction that said, okay, we're trying to get textbooks for schools for all people. We're trying to get land reform for all people. There's no evidence during Reconstruction of black leadership saying, oh, we only want land reform for black people, right? When they said Freedmen's Bureau of Abandoned Lands and Refugees, the assumption was some of those refugees were poor white people. Now imagine if poor white people got behind land reform, that 40 acres and a mule was to take all the land away from the old Confederates and the property landowners and redistribute that land to everyone. Black people were for that. You know, they weren't against that. But we don't know that story because multiracial movements end up becoming a problem for us. And why? For good reason. Because sometimes those multiracial movements are very much behind black leadership, and then pretty soon they're like, well, you know, let's put race to the side for a second. Let's put racism to the side and look at all these other things. So the Black radical imagination was focused really on black people's need to create wholeness. That is what Cedric kind of calls, you know, the ontological totality. That we're trying to find a way to become one again amidst the chaos that has divided and crushed us. But that oneness was never in opposition to everybody else. It was a oneness that's about us. And, you know, and one of the things that Cedric Robinson talks about, he says, you know, when he writes the conclusion of Black Marxism, he says, you know, the absence of violence, he says this in the nature of Black radical tradition as well, the absence of mass violence, of revenge, is one of the characteristics of the Black radical tradition. To get free is not to kill, you know, everybody else. You know, it's to get free. And that freedom opens up the space of possibility. But almost every time, once that space is opened up, it creates the occasion for multiracial movements that could keep that space open, but sometimes they abandon what actually started in the first place. So having said that, there are, I don't think that we can afford not to try to build, you know, movements that push back against racial capitalism and the colonial order. And if there are people willing to join up in those movements, willing to be not allies, but comrades, you know, then we need to embrace them. They need to be part of our struggle, but not at the expense of our struggle for wholeness, for ontological totality, you know. And I know that may seem contradictory, but we live in a world and everything is contradictory and complicated, so.
Yeah, I really like that. So Cedric talks about how Marx misses some of the social and cultural. So it becomes a kind of economic reductionism and really holds up what you celebrate, which is culture, Black culture, how we hold ourselves together, keep ourselves together. Well, Beloved's seen the ring shout, you know, the connection to Africa, the sort of way we've worked our way through the Babylon, through the wilderness of chattel slavery was through culture. And you celebrate that here. You exalt that in the new edition with Aja Monet's beautiful forward. And so I just want to say what I know you know is true. I mean, multiracial politics become difficult sometimes, not because of politics, but because of culture. You have this really cool story where I think you went to like a communist leftist meeting and they were telling you that you had to get rid of Bootsy Collins or something like that. And you were like, we need the funk. Right. Yeah, that's... So from an organizing perspective, when you realize that culture attracts so many Black people to movements, not, ideology is a part of it, but it's the music, it's the dance, it's the vibe, it's the love, it's the food. And I'm learning this with the Dream Defenders, which is a multiracial Black-led organization, how we're trying to navigate being sure that there's a decidedly Black culture with a space that's also multiracial. Can you talk a little bit about that, whatever you want to call it, tension or elephant in the room or whatever?
Right, yeah. No, that's I'm laughing because that was a conference, the socialism conference, and Stanley Aronowitz was there. I remember arguing with all these people who are now dead, and because they're dead and I'm living, I'm right. It's just how, I learned that from my peoples. But to go back, one of the ironies, that's why I was laughing, you're so right about this, is that Black culture also, for a lot of white progressives, white radicals, that was their draw to Black movements. And sometimes they're drawn to the culture, but not the people. So it's like, that's why Greg Tate, put together that book, the late, great Greg Tate, where he talks about, nothing but the burden. He said everything but the burden, rather. So everything but the burden. So you want to kind of revel in Black culture, in the music, have Black heroes, but not the burden of what it means to be Black. And of course, one could say, well, we could never experience that burden, but you can experience the burden of being in struggle. And so Dream Defenders see culture as a way of producing that ontological totality, that wholeness. For a lot of people, it's like, yeah, I'm hip, I like Motown, I like this, that, and the other. And that draws them to politics. There's a whole generation of new leftists who came to the left through Black culture. And that's tricky. But at the same time, one of the things I was wrestling with the older leftists, it was both the celebration and recognition of Black culture, but the recognition that part of what makes Black culture is its resistance to easy explanations into politics. What I mean by that is like the blues, like R&B, but the blues is not protest music. Part of what the blues does is deals with our contradictions. It deals with our desires. It deals with resistance to wage labor, but it also deals with like making bad decisions, in a hilarious way. When I was shouting, I really was saying that. I said, we need Bootsy. And I was like standing on a chair saying it, and I was surrounded by nothing but white people. Paul Buell was there. All these people were there. And I was trying to make the point that, like, I could give you a whole list. I could talk about the coup. I could talk about, all these really politically oriented, radical Black artists. But I chose Bootsy because part of it is joy, Part of the blues, and that's why the blues is not sad music, and Angela understands this. The blues is in some ways happy music because it's about being able to leap out of terrible situations and embrace joy, even in the worst of circumstances. It's also making fun and making light of the stupid shit that we do, and saying like that makes us human. There's a relationship between our recognition of the Orishas and all the mistakes and all the errors and all the stuff that they do and their power, right? And to embrace that culture And like we were joking the other day, I was saying, you know, I'm always listening to, you know, Big Bang Take Little Bang, you know. I mean, it's like I listen to all this hip hop through my daughter partly. And, you know, scared money don't make no money. I'm like, I like that. And it's true. Scared money don't make no money, you know, and these are lessons. And that, to embrace the culture is to embrace all of us. To embrace all of us. And when I was talking earlier about the way that there was a generation of black people in the late 90s who had contempt for black youth. Contempt. You know, all that stuff, even the 80s, bulldozing hip-hop, you know, CDs and all that stuff, Reverend Calvin Butts, that contempt, we can't live with that. We've got to take all of us and understand all of us. Does that mean accepting misogyny? No, it doesn't. It means to struggle with it as we recognize it in the culture. You don't write it off. You don't sort of say, oh, that's just how it is. We actually have to listen, engage, and create a set of circumstances where there are no blues. And the blues was all about creating a world where we don't have to have the blues. The term blowing the blues away is about making a culture in which we go through it, not around it, not leave it, not ignore it, but go through it in all of its dirtiness and then come out better people, right? And we can be better people, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know? And so that's part of what I think is the beauty of the culture and the beauty of embracing the culture, as long as we're honest. As long as we're honest, and that's what it means. And so my thing was, there's all kinds of retrograde, you know, music that's not black music, but they weren't talking about that. They were talking about Phil Oakes, Woody Guthrie, and Bob Dylan, but not electric Bob Dylan, you know, like really? And so that's what we were arguing about, like what is politically revolutionary music as opposed to what is it that the soul needs, and what is it that we have to confront that's difficult?
Yeah, I love that. I remember looking at this short little interview with Nina Simone, and the interviewer asked, what is freedom to you? And Nina Simone said, freedom is a feeling. And I remember being like, what? No, it's not. I've read so many books about freedom, and nowhere in those books did it say it's a feeling. It's a set of politics, there's an ism somewhere, it's a feeling. And through looking at social movements, because you talk about how social movements creates theory, our best ideas come out of protest, out of struggle. I start asking basic questions. Like, why are we playing Lil Boosie in 2014 outside the police department? Like, there's some very explicit lyrics in Lil Boosie that I will not say here, which I think is an example of that contradiction of black people in the streets unleashing something that not Lil Boosie as an individual artist, but the conditions in which created Lil Boosie spoke to something inside of us. And it was what you call the kind of revolt of the spirit of what you talk about. And then, of course, in 2020, Pop Smoke. A part of me was shocked, because there's a very explicit line in Pop Smoke that's homophobic, explicitly homophobic. And I remember watching the videos of queer and trans black people dancing to Pop Smoke at a protest. And I said, well, damn, if this ain't black, I don't know what is. So I think that's exactly right. We only have a little bit left. I just want to ask one more question. You mentioned your daughter, and you read a quotation from your daughter. Can you just talk a little bit about her influence on your work?
Elizak Carmen Akila Kelley is everything to me, everything. My firstborn, and my best friends, and my partner, and my teacher. I've learned more from her than anyone besides my mother. And she keeps teaching me. She is, she grew up with this book. she was out there with us, as she always was, in the streets on Fifth Avenue, protesting the verdict around Amadou Diallo. She was in the streets of Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1992 as a 2-year-old saying, "No justice, no peace." She listened to a lot of really hardcore gangster rap when I was writing about it when she was 3, and she knew all the lyrics. Unfortunately, the Ice Cube, I didn't think she was paying attention. So she's lived through all this. She's like, and right now she's new assistant professor at Yale, writing a book that deals with the way Black people have turned enclosure into new commons. Whether it's the block or whether it's, rooftops. And she's using literature as a way to understand that. So I have to say, I have relinquished the title of Professor Kelley. It now belongs to her. And she's also a very fine artist as well, who actually has a little hip hop thing. I won't ever play it for you, but she tried that too. Yeah, no, she could flow. She could do anything. So that's not a really helpful answer, but you can see I'm in love with my child. She's just amazing, and she's a genius. And she also represents, in many ways, this generation, which I have to say, this generation is the best. And I don't think we say that enough, because we get so nostalgic about the movements in the past. And the more we get nostalgic, the less critical we are of the limits, even the limits of their imagination. And the more romantic we become. And it's always hardest for the current generation to really get credit for breaking out of so many strictures and limitations that have shaped our movements in the past. And so, you all are, I probably shouldn't confess this, but when I met Nyle, I didn't know that Nyle had a partner. I was like you should meet my daughter. I tried. And Derica, sorry about that. I didn't know, but it's like, that's how much, not only she means to me, but how much that this whole generation means to me. And again, one last thing is that I wrote Freedom Dreams for my students. That's why, except for the new introduction and new epilogue, there are no footnotes in this book. Grad students back in the day would give me a hard time, it's not as scholarly, But of course it's not scholarly, because I didn't write it for them. I wrote it for young people. And I wrote it for people like yourself, for Derica. I wrote it for my daughter, And I'm very happy to say that some of the best letters and emails I've gotten about the book have come from high school students. Not college, high school students who are this book has been really transformative for me. So hopefully you'll have another life, and young people will come up and check it out, and like my daughter, and like you, write their own books.
Can we give it up for Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley? We just want to thank again Nikki, Resist, First Church in Boston, all of you for coming out, for staying despite technical issues, for everybody online who tuned in on a Friday night before you go to the club or wherever you go on a Friday night. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Dr. Kelley, for being here and talking to me in front of all these people. And with all that said, thank you for coming.